Hi, welcome to session 4. And in this session, we are focusing on theories of development. In the previous sessions, we've so far looked at the concept of development, and we've also looked at the evolution of thoughts about development studies and how it evolved as a multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary discipline. And so we are looking in this session. We are looking at theories of development and how they've come along with the evolution in terms of study of development. So let's begin. So, but before we go any further, we need to remind ourselves about what a theory is, and of course, a theory can be any idea or perception or any conceptual makeup that provides some kind of guiding framework. Which can be interpreted and also tested later to see if it works after it is applied to the actual reality. So that's a theory. It's just an idea, but in most cases, of course, theories have generated productive outcomes and outputs in terms of application. So the model is of course theories can't be just applied because they are just ideas. So to be able to be applied, the actors of development must use some kinds of models to guide what works and in what context and what scenarios. And of course, in that case, certain approaches must be designed on how this model would be implemented. So in that case, you have an idea, which is a theory, then you create a model on how it should be applied, how best this idea can be applied, and then you design ways of how to apply that particular theory. But of course, there is what we also call the paradigm, a paradigm which also more related to a theory, but some kind of pattern of thinking. But of course, such kinds of patterns of thinking keep changing, and therefore that is what we term as a paradigm shift. So after World War II, that is in 1945 onwards, the European countries were devastated by the conflict in Europe, and of course the war had been ignited by German and then followed by other countries were fighting for territories and so on. And so the destruction of European environments and countries and infrastructures and loss of lives and so on created a situation that was calling for intervention, and therefore the multiplier effects of this after effect were backwardness and development in these many countries. Of course, even African countries and other countries were involved because they also participated in World War II. So the effect was not just in Europe, but also across the globe. So concerns in this case were raised by the president of the US by then, because US never got so much affected, because the war was not fought internally. It was mainly fought sorry, fought in the Pacific, but also in Europe, as helping allies to win the Nazis, the Germans. So the president initiated a design of the Marshall Plan that would therefore help in contributing towards helping these European countries to get on their feet, and also, of course, to contribute to international peace and security. Of course, the fight between communism and capitalism. So in this case, you had the USSR, which is Russia and China and so on, and then you had the US and Europe, European countries fighting for capitalism. So in this case, of course, US now offered to help out these developing countries. So, of course, the whole aim was to contribute to the development of these countries to get out of poverty levels and so on. So this is now the beginning of the theories and models of development, on how such help or such contribution from developed countries to developing countries would be effected. So you can see here in so Khan and Chaudhary 2016 give us this beautiful excuse me, this beautiful time trend. And then you have, of course, in the 1940s, you have post Second World War. Then you have interest in the great overseas by especially the US and other developed countries. And then you have in 1950s application of the development experience of the rich nations in developing countries. And then you have in the 1960s, so of course 1950s, that's when you have now the modernization theory coming up. And then in 1960s, you have the dependency theory coming up, criticizing that, criticizing the practicability of that kind of modernization theory of people of developed countries trying to help the developing countries. And then in 1970s, you have more approaches coming up, and of course that's where neoliberalists begin now towards 1980s, and the neoliberals sorry, being championed by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan of the US, try to advocate. They were advocating for liberal free market and trade, whereby the state should have limited control over the operations in the market. And then in 1990s, you have going beyond human development and the beginning of post-development that was anti to the previous development strategies, and then onwards. And of course, following the 2000s, so you have a more positive view of development-related issues and other contemporary issues, and therefore towards 2000, that's when the Millennium Development Goals now come in as a global strategy to promote development. And then now end of 2015, that marked the end of Millennium Development Goals, and then we move forward with now the 2030 agenda of sustainable development goals. So this is how development thoughts and applications have been coming along, development ideas and so on. So we are going to look at some of the development theories that have been that were developed over this time trend, and how they were being applied, and some criticisms against them. So, a development theory can be a collection of theories or models about how desirable change in society can best be achieved. So, in other words, it's some kind of idea or a thought on how, if developing countries are stating that they can help developed countries to develop, then how best can they develop? So models and theories have been developed over time, and we shall look at all of this in a moment. So the modernization and state theory related to the Keynesian economics and so on belong to the classical theories, which were indeed championed in 1940s and 1950s, and then in 1960s you have radical theories of dependency theory and development, also word system theory criticizing the classical theories, and then you have neoliberalism, which now then in 1970s onwards, 1970s, 1980s, trying to champion for free market trade and so on. And then you have alternative approaches that came that were also developed alongside these other theories, main theories, including basic needs, human development, participatory development, gender development, and so on. And then we also have the post-development, which also came just after Cold War, the beginning of Cold War in 1990s, when Russia and US agreed to end the Cold War. Okay, so some recommended reading here is that you can follow this. I have attached it in your Moodle, but also you can follow the link to get this download by Nkurunziza Immanuel. So let's begin with the classicals. So the classicals main, of course, we are going to look at the modernization theory, the Keynesian theory and Keynesian economics, of course. Yeah, we won't go deep into those, but they are we'll look at them as subsets and of classical theory of modernization. So modernization theory. Development, according to modernization theory, development equals to modernization, and this emerged in the 1950s after the Second World War, and development was viewed as a process whereby developing countries or societies can transition from stage to other stages, championing economic growth, and therefore that would be the right path for towards development. That is how the countries that were developed, that's how they had gotten where they were. So for developing countries to get there, they would have also to follow the same successive stages of economic growth. That underdeveloped countries became were now a matter of foreign policy, whereby now I just talked about previously that developing countries would then come in to provide aid towards helping these developing countries to go through these successive economic growth stages to develop. So in other words, so modernization in this case was looked at as a total transformation of traditional or pre-modern society into a type of technology, and as technology and social and political society organization or institutions developed within these societies, but must relate to what the Western world had gone through, and in other words, Europe and the US, and that is why in some cases you'll find modernization is equated to westernization. That because if, for instance, African countries must develop, then they must follow the steps that the other developed countries in Europe and US had already followed, including, for instance, a shift from traditional methods of farming towards using mechanical methods of farming, and then towards now using computer technologies and so on to do some work. So it's a process of social change from traditional to modern form of societies, in other words, and this change is of course viewed from all dimensions of development, including social, economic, and psychological, plus political processes at individual but also at institutional levels. Yeah, so this is a summative table of that draws a dichotomy between traditional society and modern society, and therefore the modernists, the economists in the modern modernization theory, suggesting that the developing countries are more traditional, and therefore they need to shift to become modern societies. And they give characteristics of those traditional societies that must and they show how things should change. For instance, that the traditional societies are more agricultural, and therefore they need to shift to industrial economies. That they use, they are more reliant on primitive technology rather than advanced or mechanical. That their social relations are collective instead of following the capitalistic kind of way of individualism. That they are more characterized by rural societies, while modern societies are more characterized by urbanization. That they only they rely on kinship structures, where you have, for instance, extended families and so on, while in modern societies they rely on nuclear family, and that serves only limited functions, so people don't have to depend on their relatives to do things, and that there is and therefore all these bring about development and poverty compared to modern societies, which are more developed and therefore modernized. So this is the dichotomy they give, and therefore they argue that most African countries or countries in Asia or South America that are poor need to adopt these kind of modern ways of living, and therefore they can be developed. So there are key issues of modernization theory, and of course I already talked about development equals being equated to modernization, and modernization being a Western model of development, and economic growth under modernization theory is viewed as a key driver, whereby there is income, savings, and reinvestments. That for a country to get developed, or individuals or communities to be developed, they must create enough income, save, and then also reinvest part of that income, so that they can keep growing. and therefore that making economic growth a means to development, but also an end in itself. That development is a linear process, and that if a country has developed, therefore cannot return to go back to the previous stages. But of course, we are going to look at some of the criticisms related to that in a moment. So that the stage transition to stage transition in all dimensions of development must happen for development to occur. But also the institutional structures and governance must be liberal enough, and there must be political stability for that country to be okay to operate for all other development dimensions. But for these developing societies such as Africa to develop, they must rely on development aid or support from developing countries, therefore to be able to develop themselves. And of course, the argument is that people must develop also some entrepreneurial skills, but they also should have that entrepreneurial value and belief for them to be able to utilize well the incomes and reinvest such incomes. But at the end, there must be total transition from traditional or primitive ways towards modern ways of living, as we just looked at them under this dichotomy. So there are, of course, mechanisms that are proposed under modernization that should be followed. For instance, there must be cultural diffusion. So African countries, for instance, can adopt culture from the West, culture such as, for instance, relying on having few family members, creating a nuclear family rather than relying or having producing many children to have an extended family. There must be, of course, social evolution in terms of social structures. There should be developing wealth-oriented behavior such as entrepreneurship, where people can have this mindset of investing and reinvesting. That there must be that education should be advanced from informal to a formal kind of education, where people can be imparted with skills and knowledge to be able to do to practice development. That mass media is also important in terms of creating and disseminating information that is developmental, so that people can be able to consume such knowledge to use it for their own development. But there also should be changes in terms of technology, and therefore this technology can be used for industrialization. And of course, where the industries are, that also instigates development of urbanization. And of course, all these changes would very much depend on foreign aid, and that is, of course, for instance, most African countries, as we have talked before, rely on foreign aid. Of course, many countries, including developing countries, developed countries such as US, also itself has debts and debts with China and debts with other countries. But the whole argument for modernization is that a country, to continue developing stably, it must rely on foreign aid. Of course, in session 6, we'll look at some of in the coming sessions, we'll look at some of the disadvantages of foreign aid and advantages of it. So there are approaches to modernization theory, and of course they relate to the general dimensions of development, as we talked about them before. The economic approach, which mainly focuses on Rostow's stages of economic growth. We are going to look at those. in a moment. Then the sociological approach that mainly looks at social structures and pattern variables, where societies must change these social structures and cultures. For instance, the kinship that we were talking about, and so on. There must be psychological. The psychological approach looks at changing, modernizing societies, but focusing on changing values, motives, thinking, and so on, among those that are willing to change. Then the political approach focuses on developing and championing democracy and good governance, that it is democracy, good governance, and better security that can bring about development. So, of course, there are several development models based on modernization theory that have been put forward, but we're not going to look at them in details. But a few of them are the linear stage model, which was championed by Rostow, an economist, and suggests that societies to develop must pass through certain stages to reach an advanced phase, which is equated to development. Arthur Lewis looks at the structure change model, which focuses on which suggests that for a certain society to develop, it must experience some structural changes in terms of sectors. For instance, a shift from agricultural sector to industrial sector, change in human capital, urbanization. So therefore, transforming rural areas into urban areas, structure in terms of family size, and so on. The liberal model looks at relying on free market forces, and therefore letting demand and supply and technological advancement to lead the development process. And then there is also Keynesian model, which has to do with relying on state entirely to do planning and implementation, to lead the implementation of development processes. So we are not going to look at these in details, but you can look at these and other models under Tudor and Smith in their book of economic development. To turn chapter 3, you look at all these models. But so let's look at the linear stage model, or Rostow's stages of economic growth, which mainly champions the modernization theory. And so Rostow's stages of economic growth are 5 of them. And stage 1, Rostow says that developing countries, or most of the underdeveloped countries, have characteristics of traditional societies that mainly rely on subsistence agriculture, therefore cultivating or making ends meet for a household to live for a day, and also relies on barter trade, where someone has, for instance, a cow, and they can exchange with another person for land or something like that, instead of using monetary value. This can be, of course, for instance, witnessed in societies such as Papua New Guinea, but also just nearby here. If you visited the Congo forest, you find there the societies of the Batwa communities. So that's an indicator of such societies. Then that, however, these societies can be helped through the other strategies we talked about, the other models we talked about, and the other approaches we talked about. These societies can be helped by transforming into the second stage, which is a transitional stage, or which is also known as precondition to take off. And in here, under this when a society has reached this phase, it is characterized with specialization. It has surplus produces that can be used as raw materials for other development processes. The infrastructure begins to develop, and therefore this could lead to the third stage, which is takeoff, which is characterized by industrialization, growth, growing investment, because these societies could now use the surplus to trade, and therefore use the profits and reinvest such profits into the economy. And then therefore you start witnessing regional growth and political changes in terms of governance and so on. And this itself leads to a stage of drive to maturity, which is characterized by diversification, for instance, in terms of sectors or production of different kinds of goods and services. It's characterized with innovation, of course, championed by the entrepreneurial skills that we've just talked about, that would lead to people reinvesting, people behaving positively towards economic growth, then reliance on imports, and of course, and investment. Then this would lead to this would drive the society towards consumer oriented and durable goods that would flourish such an economy, and therefore meaning that the society can now do all these others, but then it has so much to do. For instance, now shifting towards not just goods and goods, but also service and technology and mass media and so on. And therefore, you have such sectors that would become now more dominant. For instance, now you can see what US is. I mean, they have the TikToks and Facebook and so on. People buying getting interested in buying information. So these are the stages of economic growth, and we can have, of course, the details of these more details. That stage one, you have minimal productivity, you have a few exchange transactions, you have technological improvements that is not sufficient. In stage two, you have banks, for instance, that would now deal with currency, where people now can use that currency for reinvestment. You have emerging entrepreneurial class and so on. And then you have the concept of manufacturing. Then you have, of course, the concept of manufacturing emerges, but of course with only a few factories. But then the idea is that at least they've started. Then you go to stage three, where growth becomes the norm and improvements. Then income rises, but also it gets being reinvested by the entrepreneurs, and then businesses boom. And then you have stage four, where you have modern technology being adopted in all economic activities. For instance, you have people using technology for designs, technology to market, and so on. Technology to study, for instance, what we are using apparently the online kind of delivering services and so on. And then these, of course, would lead to stage five, which where you have leading sectors that work on durable goods and so on. And then you have, of course, like fashion and so on. Then you have, of course, a surge which occurs in terms of per capita income, and you have more increased allocation to welfare programs, such as, for instance, social security and so on. Of course, the modernization theory has been criticized in many ways. For instance, it looks at development as a linear process, but of course, the idea so far, based on what we know, is that development is not cannot happen in a single way. It is nothing like one size fits all. What happens in the US it is not necessarily what will happen in the UK or in Africa or in other African countries, because societies differ. Then the theory, of course, generalizes that societies are all underdeveloped or developed. But we all know that even in, for instance, in East African countries or in African countries, you have countries that have more urbanized, developed centers, but others are not developed. But even if you go to the US, there are poor people. Okay, then of course the tradition simply becomes a residual characteristic. Of course, it's not, modernization theory does not quite internalize the idea that, of course, tradition is something that is cultural, and in this case, it is trying to have such traditions discarded. That education involvement would mainly benefit, of course, small and local elites, those that are on top, not everyone. So that is also another mishap. That, of course, it is also wrong to see societal development as predetermined. That you can't predict whether the society is going to develop or not based on particular characteristics, because we've had developed societies that have gone backward. For instance, if you take an example of what happened in Libya, it is now it's gone back to some way years back because of conflicts and so on. And then, of course, it assumes that natural resources for industrial development are available, but not all countries have such. And also presumes that people lack skills in developing world, and of course destroys some kind of culture. But it's not true. I mean, we are Africans. We all have our ways of dealing with development. So it's not necessary that we have to depend on foreign ways of developing. Okay. But of course, as much as it is criticized, there are some there are some good or positive parts of thinking about modernization theory as an approach that gives, for instance, foundation for other ways of development, such as industrialization, advanced technology, urbanization, education, increase in national savings. Of course, you have political stability, entrepreneurial skills, and so on. So it serves as a basis, as a fundamental way of thinking that looks at how societies can then be able to think towards more realistic approaches that they would apply in their own societies. So that is all with modernization theory. So after modernization theory, we look at the radical theories, which are mainly not proposing so much, but trying to criticize what the modernists have proposed. So dependency theory, of course, again following emerged in 1960s, and it was as a criticism of modernization theory, as I just said, focuses more on trying to understand the structure, the global structure, the structural relations between developing and developed countries. And it looks at how modernization theory and practice, for instance, undermines or exploits the developing countries. So they propose that developing countries are poor because of developed countries, because those developed countries have colonized, but also are trying to heavily influence what happens in developing countries. Yeah, so so the dependency theories look at the structure of the globe in a way that they are they term developed countries as the core, which is characterized by skilled labor and capitalism and class, and looks at the developing countries as periphery, which is less developed and it is exploited by the core. But even so, as I just said, the modernization theory generally looks at society as in a general way, all developing countries in general way. But like I said before, even in these developed countries and developing countries, you have those that are more developed parts in these countries that are more developed while others are less developed. And for instance, so in that case, you have in the core and the periphery, there are other nations or other parts of society that are less developed and more developed. So you have the core, you have core periphery, which is the less developed part of the core. Then you have the core periphery. So you have, yeah, you have the core, you have the peripheral core, which is the less developed part of the developed countries, and then you have the core periphery, which is a more an advanced part of the developing countries, which, for instance, if you look at the capital cities in our own countries, those are core periphery. And then you have most of the rural areas, which are periphery. So all these are the different categorization that dependency theories are trying to use to restructure the what modernization theories are terming as developing or developed countries. That all countries are living in a competing, of course, capitalistic global world, whereby those that are in core exploit those that are in the periphery. Okay, so in other words, the periphery serves the interest of the core. So the developing countries serve the interest of the developing countries, because at the end of the day, of course, the developing countries, such as African countries, are depending on those that are developed to give them aid. Then you have, of course, global capitalism, and then you have division of labor, whereby there is exploitation through labor and resources. For instance, if you look at what China is doing, and then you have influence or influencing systems such, so the developing countries bring here their experts and try to influence how developing processes should happen. And then, of course, at the end of the day, this leads to underdevelopment. So this, of course, the dependency theory relates to the word system theory, which also looks at the cores and periphery relations. And in other words, you can term that as developed countries, developing countries, and less developed countries. So the core has, of course, advanced technology and so on, compared to the periphery. And the core exploits the peripherance and periphery in this case. So this is how the radical theories of development dependency theory and word system theory are thinking in terms of criticizing what the modernization theories have proposed. And then we move to neoliberalism, which emerged in 1970s and onwards, of course, and around 1980s. And it argues that the involvement of the state in the market leads to poor performance of the market, and therefore leading to slow growth and therefore delaying these societies to achieve development. That the market should be left alone, so that demand and supply should be the ones that are actually influencing how the market should operate. For instance, that the state should uh, put few, I mean, no or more stringent policies on how the market should operate. For instance, on what kind of goods and services should be produced, or how the marketplace should operate. For instance, controlling the monopolies and oligopolies. That those such controls limit investment of by those who could have invested if such economic parameters were not introduced by the state. So so in this case, of course there is a concentration. I mean, there is this neoliberalism was championed by the then Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. The Margaret Thatcher was from UK, and then Reagan, president of the US, and therefore were the ones championing this kind of arrangement. And of course, that's why, if you have heard of the concept of structural adjustment programs, they are the ones that would now follow the neoliberalism, whereby IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were now influencing the developing countries to restructure their economies through privatization, and of course retrenchment of workers and so on. And therefore that would be one way of helping those countries to develop. So according to the neoliberals, governments must reduce spending on public sector, and therefore champion privatization. There are no government or state interventions. There should be no taxes, minimum wage requirements, and so on. Those employment bills and so on, because they limit how other most entrepreneurs and business owners would operate in the market. That the state is some kind of hostile and is against the market, and therefore, if the state is not there, then these other market forces would influence how the market should work. And then, of course, there must be increase of private sector and market forces. And of course, the guiding principle for neoliberalism, of course, what I've just talked about, privatization. Government should mainly function to provide just infrastructure. Develop, for instance, roads, so that people can be able to transport their goods very well from market to market. And then, of course, free markets without government interference would be most efficient in this case. So, of course, there is arguments for neoliberalism, that in this case, no government or state intervention could help in reducing expenses on the public. There would be increase in the rate of privatization, and therefore faster economic growth. No barriers to natural forces of supply and of demand and supply. And then capital would be made, of course, available to the rich, but that the rich then would be able to give loans to those who lack capital, and therefore can use that money for reinvestment and they should be able to help the economy grow faster. And of course, that such, if they let the rich operate freely, then the multiplier effects or the GDP at the end through consolidated fund and whatever is there, then such benefits would trickle down, and therefore from the upper class, and also benefit these lower class or the poor individuals in the urban slums, also maybe in the rural settings. That of course also neoliberalism improves competition, and therefore competition would necessitate those who are in the marketplace to create better goods and services to outcompete others, and therefore this increases the quantity and quality of goods and services. And producers and companies would then now start exporting those goods and services to many areas. So those are that is what the liberals suggest. But of course, there are arguments against the neoliberalists, such as, for instance, absence of laws. Reduce protection of the economy, for instance, in terms of environment. I mean, these industries, for instance, would just discard whatever they produce from their industries, pollute the environment, pollute water, because there are no rules to protect the environment. But with state intervention, then they should be able to be controlled. But also you have those industries and factories that exploit workers. So if there are, for instance, no rules on minimum wage and so on, then that itself would not be good for the general population. Then there are many, of course, pitfalls of privatization. For instance, of course, monopolies, where you have a few individuals owning the entire market, and that is not good for the other market players. Then, of course, again, while the neoliberals argue that the benefits would trickle down to other individuals, of course, not every citizen would benefit from such developing benefits, development benefits equally. The poor would still get less, and the rich would get more richer. So there are always inequalities of distribution. And then, of course, the poor are exploited by the market factors, so the state is needed to protect them. So following neoliberalism and those structural adjustment programs, you have alternative approaches that came up, of course, to counter these other theories. And of course, if we take a look at these, some of these we are going to look at them as independent sessions, so I will just talk about them briefly. So there is the basic needs approach, which emerged in 1970s, of course, following movements for practical approaches that modernization theory was not actually being practical, especially for some societies and individuals, especially the poor, and therefore the poor, such as, for instance, the women and so on, needed to be given, provided with basic needs such as education, health, welfare services, to be able to meet ends meet, so that they can be able to survive and therefore be better. Or attain better standards of living. And then, of course, the problem with basic needs approach is that it's some kind of foreign aid, or some kind of aid that creates dependency, whereby the poor will always now expect from those from the government, or if it's the one that is giving, and therefore they can't be able to work. So that's the pitfall with basic needs approaches. That the more you keep giving the poor, the more they do not think well, or try to implement their own skills and knowledge to be better. So because they always keep waiting for this kind of help. So in other words, basic needs approach does not favor empowerment. Then there is a human development approach, which looks at the processes of enlarging people's choices, whereby their valuable things can be expanded. And of course, for instance, what a person can do or be, such as being healthy, living longer, taking part in community, and so on. Those are termed as functionings. And then, of course, you have capabilities, which are a combination of different functionings that a person can achieve. For instance, of course, freedom to achieve the functions of education, freedom to be healthy, freedom to participate well in the market without constraints, and so on. So there are three essential measures of human development, which include health, such as how, for instance, the life expectancy, how long does a person live? So what are those factors? If a person can live longer, then it means they are developed. If in a country people can live longer, then that country would be looked at as developed from a perspective of human development approach. If they are well educated and if they have enough income to cater for other access to other resources, to have a decent standard of living, then that would be human development. So in other words, you can look at human development from perspective of what people value. If someone wants to go to school, can they go to school? If someone is sick, can they be able to go to the hospital? If they want to buy something, can they be able to buy something? So you look at it from the perspective of freedoms, choices, and rights of individuals to attain a better standard of living, which would be equated as development. Then you have the participatory development, which of course in this case you have Robert Chambers, who is a champion of participation in development, emerged in 1970s and as an alternative to the other ways of top-down kind of approach, whereby the state and other actors plan and do everything for the poor. But in this case, participatory development is advocates for everyone in the community to get involved, including women, the disabled, youth, the elders, and so on. That it's not just about men or the leaders to be able to plan for development for households or individuals, but everyone should be able to take part in developing their own community. For instance, if there is a project on infrastructure development or working on water sources and hygiene, then everyone should be able to participate in such kind of a project. Then so in other words, it emphasizes that all people that are affected by development processes, regardless of their differences, should be able to participate in such development processes. Then there is sustainable and environmental development, emerged in 1980s after following the idea that while these other development approaches were urging for industrialization, urbanization, and so on, these other development processes were leading to exploitation of resources without considering maintenance or preserving certain resources. That, for instance, if you look at, if people were to go, if we are to do fishing, then they should do fishing, but making sure that they fish, they do fishing in a regulated manner to be able to preserve fish that would keep producing, and therefore so that even the next generation can benefit from utilizing such a common resource. Okay, or if there is a forest, then that forest should be preserved, and so on. So that's what that's what the environmentalists and the champions of sustainable development are looking at, that there should be development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the quality of the future generations to meet their own needs. That while we invest and do mining and use the lakes for our own benefit and use forests and for our own benefits, then we should keep in mind that there are other future generations also coming, and it should be able to also benefit from those resources just as we are benefiting from them. So it looks at development that protects human and natural environment. Okay, so we also have rural development, which looks at all processes that look at improving the quality of life and well-being of people who live in rural areas, because in most cases you'll find that the other different theories are more focusing on urbanization, industrialization, and so on, and therefore the rural areas are being neglected in this case. So to be able to help these other rural areas to also attain better standards of living, then there must be some improvement in terms of natural capital, financial capital, human capital, communications, such as, for instance, you could also help this through rural electrification, whereby if you take you extend rural you extend electricity to rural areas, then people can be able to establish their rural-based factories and industries or businesses, to be able to have a better standard of living, just as the urban population are also benefiting. So that's why you see now most developing countries or African countries are now also channeling their resources in trying to help rural areas to also be better through all these other approaches, such as cash transfers and those other saving projects and so on. Then there is gender development, which we shall look at more specifically in session 10. Which also dates back in 1950s, whereby women were looked at as agents of development under the women in development approach, but then later evolved in 1970s and 80s to gender development, whereby it looks at the idea that both females and males should be able to participate equally in development processes, because most societies were now putting women considering women as substitutes or subsets or subjects of men. Therefore, it's men mainly who are being employed, being educated, can have easy access to health, can have easy access to loans in the bank, and so on. So gender development is looking at the idea that by favoring men alone, women were being left behind, and therefore gender development approach is looking at creating those equitable chances and equal opportunities for both men and women to benefit in development processes, and therefore emphasizing equal participation and benefit of in development processes by both men and women, because so in this case gender development looks at the idea that there must be some other ways of promoting women empowerment and girl child empowerment that should therefore lead to some kind of equality and equity between men and women. Okay, so those are some of the alternative approaches we can look at. So finally, we look at the post-development theory, and it emerged in 1980s, but then of course gained momentum in 1990s. So from 1945 up to 1989, there was Cold War between the communists and capitalists, or between the US and Russia. Therefore, that kind of Cold War was was the one influencing these other theories on how particular countries should develop and so on. So, with the end of Cold War in 1989, there was this view that the development project or development rationale or modernization theory and other kinds of ways of helping developing countries to develop had failed, and therefore it came as a critique to development theory and looking at development as a business practice in terms of economic growth, reinvestment, and so on. And so in this case, the argument was that modernization was no longer an effective model for different societies to develop, because other societies had failed, even following such kind of prescription, developmental prescription by those that are developed. So in this case, more people were now seeing the concept of development with its agenda of the Western kind of thinking, and therefore trying to look for ways of how these people in developing countries would now look for alternatives of developing themselves, rather than just focusing on how Western world has been able to develop. So there was, of course, still gap between the rich and poor countries, and it had been growing deeper and deeper, and therefore people were now viewing Western way of life or modernization as impossible for these other countries. So the proposals were that people in the grassroots should also now be able to use their own ways of developing through, for instance, reclaiming politics from the state, reclaiming the economy from the capitalists, like just as we saw under neoliberalism, reclaiming knowledge from science through building traditional knowledge, so that people can start relying on indigenous knowledge, using participatory ways of working, and of course stop relying on the state to be the main part of development process, because states were failing, even markets were failing, especially they were failing to cater for the poor to develop well. So this is the whole argument for post-development, that throughout 1945 towards 1988, all those decades, modernization theory was not producing anything. These economic models were not producing so much. The gaps between the poor and the rich were expanding. The Western model of helping the developing countries to develop was failing, and therefore a rekindle or rethinking that now, if those have failed, then maybe grassroots communities in developing countries such as Africa, South America, Asia, and so on should now start thinking about using their own local means of development. So Arturo Escobar, who is one of the main, actually the main thinker of post-development, states the following characteristics that mark this theory: that there is the theory is a fundamental rejection of the classical development theories. It is an interest in the alternative. It champions or influences interest in alternatives to development, rather than looking at the Western way of development. It's an interest. It has interest in local culture and local knowledge, of course, which lacks in the other development processes, because we have seen that they reject the traditional way of thinking and so on. Then, of course, there is some kind of champion for or advocating for solidarity or collective working together, collective way of working together among the people at grassroots level. When I say grassroots, the local, I mean the local people. Just think about your community, and you think about all community members in your area, how they can be able to work together to bring about development in your community. Sachs Wolfgang 1992 states that, of course, the development had failed, that delusions and disappointment, failures and crimes had been steadily increasing, and therefore this Western model did not work. Of course, also development is criticized and looked at as a political project. Yes, indeed, it's a political project by the imperialists or the colonialists, or it's Eurocentric that the developing countries try to enforce on the developing countries, that it's an intellectual structure whereby, of course, human living is looked at as a project, and again, it was not working. So all these are some of the reasons that would now focus on influence post-development theories to advocate for kind of grassroots, community level kind of development, rather than relying on state and other foreign forces. So, of course, it's criticized for romanticizing local communities and cultural traditions, that they would work, therefore negating the idea that foreign aid or state laws and so on could help these communities, that these communities cannot work without the state influence. That, of course, it's criticized for engaging in dichotomies, ignoring positive aspects of modernity. So in other words, it negates all aspects of modernity, and yet that is not true. Legitimizing oppression through cultural relativism, and then, of course, prescribing ways of living to the people in the global south. So that the bottom line is, so that marks the end of post-development theory. And of course, there are other, after, like I said before, after the following post-development, new ways have and new thoughts of thinking about development and practice have been happening by different development actors, and we've seen the coming of Millennium Development Goals, which were initiated in 2000 and ended in 2015, and now we've seen the birth of Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, which are also set to be achieved by 2030, and we'll see how that happens. But of course, the fact that we moved from the 10 Millennium Development Goals towards 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that shows how many development issues are needed to be addressed, because even these other Sustainable Development Goals, under each there are different targets that must be achieved. So that shows you how development is contested, how it is complex, and how it is ambiguous, that there can't be one way of achieving it. So the theorizing of development has been evolving, in other words, and of course more theories and models and approaches of how communities and societies and nations can develop, or how the global inequalities and poverty can be reduced. Those are still coming, and we'll see how things go. But of course, the whole truth is that there is, over time, there is this shift from viewing development as a one size fits all to development as a contextual aspect, whereby different communities or different nations have different ways of applying development processes. So these are some of the recommended readings. You can search them through, and you can some of them are provided, while others you can search for them, and therefore that marks the end of this session. Thank you.